So Paige Jokey is a staff attorney at the Educational Law Center, PA, where she represents students, conducts trainings, and advocates to address the individual and systematic educational barriers facing students in Pennsylvania. She is responsible for leading the Educational Law Center Black Girls Education Justice Initiative. Paige is a proud inaugural winner of the Temple Law Students Public Interest Network's 2022 Public Interest Impact Award for impactful and legal advocacy. Now for our second speaker, Thalia Gonzalez. She is a professor of law and Harry and Lilman Hastings and research chair at UC Law San Francisco. She's a facilitator, co-director of the Center for Racial and Economic Justice, and additionally holds an appointment as a senior scholar in the Center of Gender Justice and Opportunity at Georgetown Law. As an interdisciplinary scholar, she engages in applied research within collaborative community partnerships that aim to disrupt structural drivers of racial and gender disparities in the public system. Please help me welcome our two speakers. Take it away.
And if I could just jump in 1 second, we unfortunately received notice that Professor Gonzalez is unable to join us this morning. She did run into a family issue, and so we send our thoughts and prayers to her. But I have no doubt that Attorney Jokey is going to fill our 45 minutes with incredible information. So take it over.
Thank you very much. Is it possible for me to share my screen, or are my slides already uploaded? I'm going to try to share my screen.
You should be able to share.
Okay. Just 1 second here.
Just a reminder to the participants, Director of Communications did put in the digital program again so that it's refreshed in your chat feed.
Okay.
I don't believe I'm seeing it, although I have several screens up at the moment.
Why don't you try it now? It should be able to share. There we go.
There we go.
Can folks see my screen, or is somebody else sharing?
Yeah, I'm seeing your screen.
Are you seeing the one with the presentation?
No, I'm seeing the conference.
I'm going to stop sharing just for 1 second. So sorry about this.
No problem. We're all accustomed to the tech world at this point.
I can pull it up as well.
Would you mind doing that? I think that might be
Sure.
easier rather than watching me fumble. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for your patience. I really appreciate it, and for the wonderful introduction. As was mentioned, unfortunately, Talia is not here today, but I will cover as much of her content as I can. And we still have a very ambitious agenda for our 45 minutes. As was mentioned, I am a staff attorney at Education Law Center Pennsylvania's Philadelphia office, and my work really centers on supporting young people who are experiencing homelessness on their own and with their families. And I also have the distinct privilege of leading Education Law Center's Black Girls Education Justice Initiative, which is hyperlinked here, and I'll get into what that means and what that work looks like. And I think that's so important, especially for today's conversation about how we can keep young people in their classrooms learning and prevent entry into pathways to confinement, also known as the school to prison pipeline. Next slide, please.
1 second. It doesn't seem to be advancing. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you very much for doing this. For the folks that happen to know me on the call, technology is not my strong suit, so I so appreciate that you are advancing the slides. So thank you for your patience with me. So here's a little bit about what Education Law Center does. We're a legal services nonprofit, and our mission is to ensure access to quality public education for all children in Pennsylvania. And we pursue our mission through priorities like adequate and equitable school funding, equal access to quality schools, and of course, dismantling the school to prison pipeline, which I know we're all very eager to engage with today. And our mission really focuses on students who are the least well served by our education system. And we challenge those barriers that are created through our systems that deny children the opportunities that they need and they deserve. Next slide, please. So our Black Girls Education Justice Initiative begins with the belief that Black girls must be fully and holistically supported, affirmed, and celebrated, and provided with every opportunity to thrive at school. That requires the specific investment of time and resources to address barriers that arise because of anti-Black racism, sexism, and other forces of oppression, and developing and implementing unique legal strategies to address these barriers. Next slide, please. So what is anti-Black racism? So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but this is a definition that I like to use from the Center for Social Policy, which reflects that any attitude, practice, or policy that explicitly or implicitly reflects the idea or belief that Black people are inferior to another racial group. And anti-Black racism, unfortunately, is pervasive in our education system. I had the opportunity to look at what was shared in the chat, and there was a lot of really important discourse about the ways that Black and brown young people are made to feel unwanted and unsafe at school. And so when you think about how school-based practices arise, they're so normalized in the ways that we imagine that we teach curriculum that it can seem impossible to create a different reality. But that is why we're here, is to really think through what can we do to make sure that students have what they need at school. Next slide, please. So, as you know, education is a fundamental right in Pennsylvania. That is a sentence I will never get tired of saying. Education Law Center was one of the key groups involved in the William Penn litigation, which was groundbreaking litigation challenging Pennsylvania's unconstitutional funding system and establishing that education is a fundamental right. The education clause in our state constitution requires that every student receive a meaningful opportunity to succeed academically, socially, civilly, and that requires that all students have access to comprehensive, effective, and contemporary systems of public education. And the image here is depiction of a young person who is exercising her right to demand the type of education that she is due. Next slide, please. So one of the things that Talia is an expert in is discussing the ways that school and education and what happens at school impacts every facet of a young person and their opportunities. And what we mean by social determinant of health is that education really is an important factor about what types of opportunities young people get now and in the future. So we know that studies are clear that young people that have access to a high school diploma or GED live 10 years longer than folks without that level of educational privilege. It is a defining privilege that opens up access to things like permanent and adequate housing, likelihood that you'll be in communities where you have the resources that you need, physical and mental health care, nutritious foods, distance from environmental hazards and incarceration. And so we know that when we are sending young people out of the classroom, the consequences last a lifetime and they are intergenerational in nature, which is why this work is so important that we're all doing. Next slide, please. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the legal framework that enables schools to exclude students. I will not be going into a super deep dive on Know Your Rights, But all of the resources are linked in the slides, and I will be sure if it is appropriate to send a PDF, that way you can click through all of the resources. And I will also give you some practice tips that I use every day as an education civil rights attorney to better support young people who may be experiencing exclusionary school discipline. So if you hear me saying an acronym of ESD, what I mean is exclusionary school discipline. So the first thing to know is that schools can only discipline for behavior that is against adopted school rules. Sometimes those rules are called codes of conduct or student handbooks. They can be thick. I read them often. Sometimes they're upwards of 60 pages. And they define what you can do, what you can't do, and what happens if you do something that's against the rules. So the first thing you need to know is if it's not a published rule, you can't be punished for it. So for example, I like to write with blue pen. And let's say I complete an assignment in blue pen and they say, oh, you completed it in blue pen instead of something else. Now you're going to be excluded from the classroom. If that's not in the rules, the school can't do it. The second thing is any consequences that are imposed have to be outlined in the rules and applied to the behavior at issue. That means that if the school doesn't say they can suspend or expel a young person for a behavior, they can't. You're not allowed to make up consequences as you go because students have a right to notice about what behavior could lead to an exclusion. And just to be clear, and I'll get into this more on another slide and give you some data, but Education Law Center does not support the exclusion of young people from the classroom, full stop. It doesn't work, it's not effective. And so when I'm telling you what the law says, I just want to be clear that that what the law allows does not create situations where students can be safe and affirmed if they can be excluded. So if you're thinking about what behavior, so remember the behavior is in the rules, there's a consequence outlined. When can behavior happen? So think about things like at school, on the way to or from school, or at a school sponsored event. Generally, that is the scope of where schools can discipline. There are some limited exemptions when schools can discipline outside of school grounds. May I please have the next slide? Thank you very much. So you can only discipline for behavior if it has a substantial impact on the school community. And there is important case law from the Supreme Court that finds that off-campus speech, including the use of profanity to express displeasure with the school, did not have a substantial impact and the conduct couldn't be regulated. And that involved social media and a young person that was participating in cheer and was making comments about her school. Next slide, please. So we turn to the law, and I've hyperlinked the statute. So if you're a legally minded person like me and you want to actually read what our law says, they're all here for you. So the first thing is that I want to just note the terminology here. So our law uses the words verbatim, exclusion from classes. And that's really important to think through, that even the language that's used, it's about exclusion, it's about removal, it's about taking a young person from an environment that could be supported and excluding them. It's not about giving them skills, it's not about anything else. It's just about saying you cannot be in the classroom. That's what is generally referred to in Pennsylvania as an in-school suspension. And so school entities, so that's public schools, must make provision. And school entities are also defined in the rules. So sometimes it can get more complicated than just a public school, but just know for now that school entities must make provision for the student's education during the time of in-school suspension, and there are due process protections. And what due process means is that a school has to follow certain procedures and safeguards for students' rights if they are going to exclude students. So if you happen to want to know more about in-school suspensions and students' rights, if you click that link, there's a beautiful chart on pages 3 and 4 that describe what students' rights are in each disciplinary context. May I please have the next slide? So what is out of school discipline? So that's behavior that can result in the school saying you can't come. And again, the behavior must be defined and published. And what published means is the school needs to put it on the internet and otherwise circulate the rules. And rules vary widely across local education agencies, LEAs. So that means that there are many, many codes of conduct. There are 779, and sometimes just the local education agencies. And that's like the school district level. And sometimes individual schools have handbooks too. So when you're thinking about what rules apply, it can be really difficult for families to know what rules apply to their children. So I represent a lot of families where there are siblings. So I'm an only child myself, but sometimes you have kids that are in elementary school, middle school, and high school. And sometimes some students go to a charter school, which is a public school, and other students go to a district school. And that parent may need to be understanding the rules for all of those different schools. And that is how it can be so confusing. And I'm actually going to give you some examples of things that are against the rules in Pennsylvania that can result in exclusion as well. So I promise we'll get into the nitty-gritty. So the first term that you should know is suspension. So that's exclusion from 1 to 10 days. Expulsion is a period exceeding 10 days in a row and might be permanent. Unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, you can permanently expel a young person from school. And students who are under 18 and subject to compulsory school attendance law, that's our Truancy Law Act 138, must still be provided with an education. Now, what happens in practice is a lot of times students are suspended and expelled, but schools don't use those terms. It doesn't matter what term is used, it matters the length of the exclusion. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So it looks like I gave you a little spoiler. So if you look to the box on the left, what's really important to remember is that, again, there are due process protections that apply in suspensions and expulsions. So the two links that are here in this part of the slide, one is a fact sheet on what to do if a young person is facing suspension, and the other is about what to do if a young person is facing expulsion. And those are both from our Back to School Guide. I will be sure to circulate the link to Education Law Center's Back to School Guide, or if my wonderful colleague Ariella Gregson happens to be on, maybe she can drop it in chat if she has permission. This is a huge compendium of over 60 fact sheets that address pretty much any educational issue you can think of. So know that there are free resources available for families. Something else that's really important to know is that young people with disabilities are entitled to a free, appropriate public education as required by law and have additional protections in the school discipline context. I apologize for my box being a little bit over to the right, but I'm going to tell you what that information says. So here are practices that Education Law Center unfortunately sees all the time that count as suspensions and expulsions, even if the school is not using those words. Asking a caregiver to pick up a student early, sending a student home early, locking a young person out of the school building, telling the student not to attend and then marking them present. That is a huge problem because schools are legally obligated to accurately keep records. That means if Paige Jokey wasn't in that seat, you can't say that I was. You also, assigning a student to a virtual program and then preventing them from attending in person is also something that is an exclusion that needs to be taken under consideration. And students are entitled to due process in those cases. Next slide, please. So how do we support young people who are experiencing exclusionary school discipline ESD while it exists? Hopefully we will live in a Pennsylvania sometime soon where this is not a tool that schools have. But for now, here's what you should know. So please check the beautiful chart on pages 3 and 4 of the linked resources on the left to learn more about what students' protections are. Here are some things I always invite families to do. Get to know your school's code of conduct. Schools make changes every year, and actually now is the time to weigh in. If you are a caregiver to a young person, if there are young people in your life that go to public school and you want to weigh in on their code of conduct, there are many opportunities for you to do so. Some schools offer surveys, others offer focus groups, and there are school board meetings that families can testify to talk about the impact of rules at their school. What's really important is sometimes rules follow years and years and years, and until they're brought to somebody's attention, they can't be dismantled. So don't be shy about looking through those resources and making sure that you understand. Sometimes schools require families to sign the very first page, but families don't know what it is that they're signing. So I wouldn't be doing my job as a lawyer to just give everybody a refresher to make sure that if somebody doesn't understand something, they're not signing it. And if you need language access or it isn't accessible in a written format, to make sure that the school is aware of that. Make sure that you're reading everything that the school sends to you and keep your receipts. That means you want to make a phone log when you call the school. You want to follow up all conversations in writing in an email. You could say something as short as, "Thank you for speaking to me about Paige's suspension." I have concerns because the school does not have a rule against using blue pen, and I would like this expunged from her record. And make sure you keep a copy of those suspension notices too. If you're like me, sometimes keeping track of lots of paperwork can be a challenge. So take a picture, email it to yourself, make sure you have it handy. Always ask the young person what happened. I can't tell you how many times that I read a report that quite frankly uses criminalizing language, calls students offenders and perpetrators, that mirrors language in the adult criminal justice system, which is not appropriate language to be talking about young people using. And what is on paper is not at all what has happened. And so it's important to ask that young person and talk about what happened and what they may have witnessed. This can be very traumatic to students because being excluded is traumatic, and also experiencing whatever happened might also be traumatic. And so some of the strategies that I use, we have actually a checklist on our website that we use to report bullying and harassment, but I think it has some really useful applications here because it talks about how you go through a situation. Like, where did it happen? Was there a teacher? Was it reported? Did you see cameras around? You know, making sure that you have as much detail as possible, and making sure that that young person knows why you're asking questions. Oftentimes, caregivers will ask me to speak to their child, and I'm always clear about my role and why I'm asking questions. That way I'm not probing into areas that are painful without an explanation. And also learn about students' rights and challenge rights violations. At the end of this presentation, all of the resources that are linked throughout are at the end of our slides, and I also have Education Law Center's helpline information. We run a free legal helpline. We field over 1,000 calls every year for families looking for advice. And so if something that I'm saying is resonating with you and you think that somebody needs legal help, you could consider contacting Education Law Center. Next slide, please. So now we've talked about the legal ability to impose exclusionary school discipline, I think it's important to think through the consequences. So what we know is studies are clear that it does not modify students' behavior. It does not improve outcomes or keep them safe. Thank you so much for dropping the report into the chat. And there are a lot of the information from that report is actually in this slide. So the other important thing to remember is that exclusionary school discipline doesn't improve academic outcomes for either students who are excluded or those in the classroom. So there's this impulse of, if somebody is behaving, a young person, a child is behaving in a way that an adult doesn't like or can't handle, the idea is, well, they just can't be here. But that doesn't actually teach students anything, and it doesn't improve academic outcomes, which is one of the key justifications that I see in my work for exclusionary school discipline practices. There are a range of lasting harms that stem from the use of exclusionary school discipline, like that students are more likely to repeat a grade. Another word you might see in the literature is being retained. That means you have to repeat a grade. And a single suspension makes it more likely that a young person is pushed out of school before they're able to graduate, and more likely that they're going to enter either the juvenile or adult criminal legal system. And we know that also that young people who are suspended or expelled for discretionary school rules are 3 times more likely to be in contact with the juvenile criminal legal system. And students with disabilities are 4.5 times more likely to be excluded than their non-disabled peers. And I have some specific slides on disproportionality, so fear not, and also some school rules for us to grapple with together. Next slide, please. So this is really Talia's wheelhouse, but what I wanted to show you is that many of you are, or maybe all of you are familiar with ACEs, adverse childhood events. If you look at the column on the left, those are ACEs that were in the original study. That has since been expanded, and now there are proposed ACEs that have been expanded. What you see in the orange boxes on the bottom right is that 3 of those things are related to exclusionary school discipline. And in fact, there was a conference put on by the Journal of the American Medical Association that was hosted at CHOP that actually talked about the need to include exclusionary school discipline as an ACE. And actually, there's a willingness among many pediatricians to actually be doing a screening for exclusionary school discipline because it is a health risk factor for a multitude of things. And so I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to actually create a system where doctors and others can really catalog what is happening to young people. Next slide, please. So racism really drives disparities in exclusionary school discipline. The thing that's most important to know is there's not any differences in student behavior. for Black and brown young people, but they're punished more often and more harshly than white students for identical behavior. In fact, the Pennsylvania Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights concluded that both discriminatory rules and bias from decision makers leads to push out even after you control for other variables. What does all that mean? It means that even when you take everything else away, the difference is the student's race that's controlling how the rule applies to them and how they are punished. Again, this is not about a student behaving differently. It's about adults behaving in discriminatory ways against students, be that intentional or not. The impact is still the same, right? And it's about the rules being set up to exclude Black and brown young people from education spaces. In fact, we at Education Law Center field a number of cases which are always heartbreaking, where students are actually excluded for responding to unlawful harassment that they're facing. And unfortunately, schools in many of these cases have not done an investigation at all into what has happened, or done an investigation that is comprehensive or trauma informed. And what we know is that pushout begins in preschool. So we are talking babies are suspended from their daycare, from their early learning. Black children make up only 18% of the preschool population in the United States, but receive 50% of all recorded suspensions, and a whopping 47% of Black preschoolers have been suspended from their preschool program. And many students are suspended, and I can talk to you about my own caseload for just a minute here, for things like spilling a juice box, crying, and I'll also be giving you some examples of matters that we have handled at Education Law Center to give you sort of some background on how things are flowing in just a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So suspensions and expulsions are not equally felt by students. I'm not going to read you all of these facts, but I just invite you to engage with the reality that Black students are deprived of 5 times the number of school days. Black girls are way more likely to experience suspension more than once compared to white girls. And this leads to being funneled into the juvenile and adult criminal legal systems. And this is so heartbreaking because actually Pennsylvania has some of the highest student arrest rates in the country, and particularly for Black girls are even more pronounced. So Black girls are 5 times more likely than white girls to be arrested at school for identical behaviors. And oftentimes these arrests are happening for things like excessive noise, obscene language and gestures, disorderly conduct, which again is something borrowed from the criminal legal system, which was created to target Black people and create institutions of anti-Black racism in the United States and perpetuate them, with its origins in Jim Crow. So when you think about why are students arrested at school, this is what is often happening. And the items in quotes are the actual school rules. And what you'll notice is that they are vague, they're subjective, and they're really discretionary. And that's why we have such trouble with disproportionality in Pennsylvania and beyond. Next slide, please. Ableism also drives disproportionality. As I mentioned earlier, children with disabilities in Pennsylvania are sadly suspended at a rate more than double of the rate of peers who don't have disabilities, and 1 in 11 young people with disabilities will be subject to an out-of-school suspension. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of real school rules in Pennsylvania, things students can be suspended and expelled for doing. Having disrespectful tone or body language, talking back, refusing to cooperate, silently mouthing words. That's something I do whenever I'm looking at a PowerPoint presentation. Some of you also might be silently reading to yourself. If you were a student in a school in Pennsylvania that had this rule, you could be suspended or expelled for this behavior. Another one, slouching in one's chair, sucking one's teeth, disruption, which is literally defined as eating or drinking, standing, running, or being loud. And what you'll notice is a lot of these behaviors are normal, developmentally appropriate behaviors for young people, and also behaviors that adults exhibit, and yet they can lead to suspension and expulsion. There are also many racist rules that fuel push out. So things like having hairstyles that are not neat or well groomed, that are innovative, distracting, extravagant, colored, flamboyant. And some schools will even ban Combs, hair, headscarves, bonnets, hooped earrings larger than the size of a quarter, or so-called excessive jewelry. What's important to know is that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission has a regulation that deals with protective hairstyles and protects students' rights to express their race at school. So race includes protective hairstyles like mine, box braids, locks, knots, twists, puffs. It's supposed to be liberally interpreted, and hair texture. So I can't be discriminated against for having hair that is curly, right? I've seen school rules that say you can have a high top fade, but not if it's curly, right? So young people are being discriminated against and expelled even for how their hair grows from their head. That's illegal, right? And also rules that discriminate on the basis of sex, which includes gender identity and expression. And there are wonderful resources on PHRC's website, including some examples of what qualifies as illegal discriminatory conduct. If you feel like your rights are being violated, there are ways to file complaints, and Education Law Center actually has a stepper that you can use on how to file a complaint with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Next slide, please. So here is a real example. Nia is a pseudonym, so not her real name, but these facts are based on real lived experiences from Education Law Center's clients. And I do invite you to take care here, because hearing about this can be really traumatic, especially if this has happened to you or a loved one. So Nia is a 5-year-old who has autism, who was fearful to attend school because her classroom was loud and overstimulating. She was consistently sent home early, which is, again, a suspension, for crying and having so-called tantrums, despite the K-2 suspension ban that applied in the area where she was living that was supposed to protect her. Her mom lost her job as a result and needed to enter emergency shelter. In response to Nia crying and throwing a book to the floor, the school called 911, so crisis, on her, and sought an involuntary psychiatric commitment for a 5-year-old child. When crisis arrived, they then called the police to respond and sought to have 5-year-old Nia arrested. After the team that was dispatched from crisis declined to 302 her. That's the statute name for an involuntary psychiatric commitment. So if you hear the word 302 or the numbers 302 rather, that's what that means. These are examples of what are happening to our youngest learners, and it transcends all across the school to prison pipeline. So let's take another example in high school. Next slide, please. Janae, who's a 12th grader with an IEP, she has emotional disabilities and has survived inappropriate physical and sexual behaviors at school and has behavior needs for social skills that her school is aware. After being hurt by a group of students at her school that were harassing her, she was suspended for the rule against mutual combat, which is actually a term that appears in many school codes, which is offensive. It's criminalizing. And it also leads to things like students being punished after they are subject to inappropriate physical behaviors at school. The school sends her home for the day of the fight, which is again a suspension, and then had a police officer who was armed in a squad car deliver her suspension notice to her. Janae then tried to return to the school once the suspension was over and was locked out. She was later expelled, missed weeks of school, and needed to engage a lawyer in order to be enrolled into an appropriate program that she was legally entitled to attend and could meet her needs under her IEP. Thankfully, she was able to graduate, but that outcome isn't often what happens in these types of cases. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, there's a rise in practices around exclusionary school discipline. Talia is really the expert here, and I'm so sad you won't get to learn from her today, but if there's a way for us to bring her in another capacity, please let us know, and I'm happy to try to arrange that. What you'll see here is an increase in rules that are restrictive and lead to push out of young people that are cropping up across the nation. Things are subjective on these rules, and there is also certain conduct around dress and grooming codes like I talked about. I'm not going to get into this too much, but just know that unfortunately there's a wave of rolling back of policies that support students and advancing policies that lead to exclusion and all of the terrible consequences that stem from that. Next slide, please. So now that we've gone through the many, many reasons why exclusionary school discipline doesn't work and it's harmful, there is a study that I want to uplift by Talia Gonzalez and Rebecca Epstein. This is the Talia that I was going to co-present with, about building foundations of health and well-being in school. It's a study of restorative practices in girls of color. It's a beautiful report, and it has wonderful recommendations and bullet points, which I'm always a huge fan of. And here are some things that do work. Developing community. So I have the privilege of going into many schools, and I can think of one school in my mind where I walked in and there were beautiful murals. And there were adult staff that looked like the students who were greeting them and asking them how their day was and saying, I am so happy you were here. I missed you yesterday, right? There was music playing that was culturally responsive and affirming. And young people were invited to engage in deep breathing if they were stressed, to refocus and engage. There was breakfast being served, so students had nutrition and were ready to learn for the day. And that develops community, right? We know that schools serve such an essential role as protective factors, right? It gets students access to resources like specialists, nutrition programs, language access, right? Special education programming, behavioral supports. And so we know that when schools are working in ways that are affirming, they are life-changing for students. Also providing socio-emotional learning opportunities, youth empowerment, and resilience building practices. It is so important for young people to actually build the skills that they need to survive and thrive in our world. And that's what schools are supposed to be doing. So if you say, Paige, you can't come because you used a blue pen and that's not in the school rules, I'm not learning anything different, right? And so it's really important that young people are actually given the skills that they need to self-regulate, right? To identify when they're feeling reactive or that they may escalate, to know how to advocate for themselves, right? And also to be in community with one another. That's not to say that when something happens, there shouldn't be a response. There should be, right? And if there is something that's causing harm in the school community, it needs to be addressed in a way that really accounts for and attends to the community harm that can happen and focuses on repairing and restoring relationships, right? It's important that young people know how to be accountable, that they know how to apologize, and also know how to say, hey, like, I really could benefit from using certain skills that I don't have. Could you teach me? I'll never forget, I was in one meeting, an IEP meeting, a special education meeting for a student. And I'll give the student's name, we'll call him Billy, was often in trouble and sent out of the class for not raising his hand. And the teacher reported, Billy always calls out. And I said, does Billy know how to raise his hand and know how to engage in a discussion? And the answer was no. And so we actually wrote that into his plan. And so I think sometimes, and I can speak for myself as an adult, sometimes I forget what it's like to be a young person, right? And so thinking about, is there a way we can give a student a skill to meet a need? I like to think about it like Legos. So if there's a behavior need, where is your skill? You want them to match. What you don't want to do is just say, you can't come to school. So really making sure that young people have what they need. This creates benefits for the entire school community. Would you mind advancing to the next slide, please? So supportive school communities benefit everybody. So they strengthen bonds between students with each other, so their peers, students with teachers, teachers to their jobs. Teachers are amazing, wonderful people. I am the daughter of 2 educators, and I think the absolute world of teachers. And so when we do restorative practices, it's so important because it actually makes their lives and jobs easier, and they want to stay. We know that we have a critical barrier with retaining teachers in Pennsylvania, retaining teachers of color in particular. We have schools, 48% of our school districts have not a single educator of color, full stop. That's not acceptable, right? And so when we're creating environments where everybody wants to be and feel safe and affirmed, that matters. And you know what? Those bonds go beyond the schoolhouse doors. They help strengthen our families. They help strengthen our communities. And they allow schools to function as the epicenter of supports and resources that they can and should be for young people. What does this lead to? Improved outcomes, mental health and well-being, increases in students' access to the care that they need, social skills, and bonds inside and outside of school. So I can see that I'm running a little bit low on time. And so I am going to give you just a very, very brief overview of the resources. And then if there's still time, I'm happy to take a question or two. And just want to acknowledge everybody that's emoting in the chat and also giving me great facial expressions. That is so wonderful. And I feel very supported and affirmed. So thank you for being so patient, especially with my tech difficulties and flying solo today. I just have really appreciated getting to learn from each and every one of you. So let us conclude with how do we learn from each other? Next slide, please. Here's our back to school guide. I know it's been circulated. There are also our helplines. If you happen to call the wrong one, we can get you to the right place. But if you're in Eastern or Central PA, call the 215 number. And if you're in Western PA, call the 412 number. I also linked all of the discipline resources throughout. So things on suspension, expulsion and expulsion toolkit, and preventing suspension and expulsion in preschool settings. And there are also information about rights of students for people with disabilities throughout. If you know anybody that happens to be in a suspension or expulsion proceeding, print out that fact sheet and bring it with you. I use it all the time, and I have it on my desktop when I'm talking to families because it's a nice refresher on what schools can and cannot do right in front of you. And so if the school has questions, you can also share that resource with them. They're free, send them everywhere. We are super happy to have them circulated, and stay tuned. Subscribe to our newsletter on our website because every year we release a back to school guide, and 2024 will be no different. So please stay tuned for additional resources from us. Next slide, please. If you want to learn more about our Black Girls Education Justice Initiative, I invite you to read our fabulous groundbreaking report, We Need Supportive Spaces That Celebrate Us. Black Girls Speak Out About Public Schools, which centers the lived experiences of Black girls in Pennsylvania schools. They are the experts of real-time conditions, and their expertise is honored. In this report, we conducted focus groups and feedback sessions and created 8 recommendations at the girls' that were recommended by the girls to create affirming and supportive school spaces. If you wouldn't mind just heading to the next slide for a quick second here. Here are the recommendations. You can take some time to read them, but I'm going to go through the top level recommendations with you. We need to have supportive staff. We need to have teachers, administrative, and staff that look like the students that they're serving, right? Black girls need access to culturally responsive and affirming curriculum, fair dress codes that affirm students' rights to cultural and gender expression, access to mental health supports, particularly from providers that share lived identities and experiences with Black girls, removing police, ensuring schools have sufficient resources, and making sure that students are able to still navigate in the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you so much for your time. I can see I have 3 minutes left, and I'm happy to allow for a break or take a question if there happens to be one. And if you need to get in touch with us at Education Law Center, we have resources. I'm always happy to chat. And if you happen to be an organization that works with young people that wants to know your rights trainings, that is something that we do, and we invite you to contact us if you are interested. One thing that I didn't mention about our helpline is we provide free legal services. We never take any money from any family. So please don't allow a resource barrier to create a situation where families can't access the rights-based information that they deserve and need to protect students' fundamental right to education in Pennsylvania. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Attorney Jokey. I wasn't sure, Greg, if you were gonna field the questions again.
I can field the questions. So I know that someone made a comment in the chat that this is important information, especially as I advocate for my brown-skinned biracial daughter at her school. Is there any chance these slides will be shared?
Yes, absolutely. And some other fact sheets that we didn't talk about is we have one about your right to be free from racism and right to expression. Those are 2 resources that also might be helpful. And I really appreciate that being uplifted. One other note is that our report is 40 pages. I think it's lovely. And if 40 pages isn't for you, we also have a companion guide that we just released that distills the report's recommendations into 5 pages. However, if you happen to be a report reader and you're looking for something to do on your train time, it is optimized for film use. So if you need a way to invest your time, consider learning with us through that report.
Absolutely. And then the rest of the comments are basically profound presentation. Thank you so much. I learned so much from your presentation. Awesome. Thanks for the information. I have to also sign off on that. That was an excellent presentation. Very informative. And we're thankful once again that you came and spoke with us today. I'm going to pass it back to you, Director Chang.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you so much, Attorney Jokey. And I know, again, we didn't have the opportunity to have Professor Gonzalez with us, but the information that you provided on her behalf was fantastic. You've already mentioned your report, but I just want to underscore both Attorney Jokey's report, We Need Supportive Spaces. It as well as Professor Gonzalez's work, Girlhood Interrupted. Both of those are included in the digital program that was dropped in the chat now twice. And again, we'll provide the post session resources. So Attorney Jokey, any of those one-pagers, anything like that that you'd like included, or a link, directly to those, we're happy to include them at the updated version of the program. But I would strongly encourage everyone here, as you have time, to take a look at both of those reports. They're absolutely phenomenal and so appropriate for this discussion. So now I am honored to introduce our keynote speaker. We are blessed to have Dr. Howard C. Stevenson from University of Penn. Dr. Stevenson is a nationally sought expert on how to resolve racial stress and trauma that affect health at every stage of life. His work prepares children and adults to assert themselves during face-to-face microaggressions that undermine academic and work productivity. Key to this racial healing work is integrating cultural strengths to reduce in-the-moment threat reactions, increase access to memory, physical mobility, and voice, and prevent long-term health detriment. Dr. Stevenson has served for 32 years as a clinical psychologist, working in under-resourced rural and urban neighborhoods across the country. His book, Promoting Racial Literacy in Schools, Differences That Make a Difference, summarizes this work. Dr. Stevenson currently serves as the Constance Clayton Professor of Urban Education, Professor of Africana Studies in the Human Development and Quantitative Methods Division of the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the Executive Director of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative, a research program development and training center that brings together community leaders, researchers, authority figures, families, and youth to study and promote racial literacy and health in schools and neighborhoods. Please join me in welcoming the extraordinary Dr. Howard C. Stevenson. Dr. Stevenson, the floor is yours. I did receive your email, and so if you'd like to attempt to share, you certainly can.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'll try to share. And a big thank you to Executive Director Lassiter for this opportunity, and as well as the committee. Let me know if you can see.
We can say.
Okay, great. So my talk is called CROPS, which stands for Changing Racial Outcomes in Proximal Spaces, Racial Literacy for Disrupting the School-to-Prison Pipeline. In all of our work, we start with a story. And before coming to Penn, I worked as a clinical psychologist for many years, directing residential treatment centers for physically and sexually abused children and families. And I love the work, every bit about it, because as sad as it might be perceived, that there's so much hope in working with children who face some incredibly horrible experiences, that even through that trauma, healing is possible. But it means you have to get up close to folks. And as much as I love this, I was working 60 hours a week. I love being a therapist. I also saw myself as a scientist. And I started to write. And even though I wanted to write about questions and research around ideas to not only engage young people and families, but also create programs that might identify them. And the question that I was interested in is around this notion of racial socialization, which is about how Black and brown families protect their children from hate. And as much as I wanted to be able to write about these issues, I tried to write, but I didn't really get the time, working 60 hours a week and driving an hour and a half away. So when I came to Penn, I had dreams. I had dreams that finally I'd get a chance to write. I'd have colleagues that would write with me, because you need help to publish in a place like Penn. And I had dreams that we would go to the coffee houses around Penn and that we would read each other's work. We would look into each other's eyes. We would hold hands and skip into the sunset of academic nirvana. Those were my dreams. Unfortunately, though, it didn't always work out that way, but I was going to try. I started out very much as the first Black psychologist in the department. I was going to become the kind and gentle colleague. I had a strategy that if I could shapeshift myself ever so slightly, so as to not threaten my colleagues, that maybe they would go with me to the coffee houses and we could go look into each other's eyes, hold hands, and skip. But after a year of trying all of that, it didn't quite work out, and my dreams did not come true. And I became saddened about that and thought about maybe I should go do something else. And in the process, I picked up a Philadelphia Inquirer, the magazine insert. And when I looked at the insert, there were some images, some pictures that seemed eerily familiar to me. And I decided to read on, because sometimes when you're disillusioned about your future, magazines can help you. And I came across this article called Another Country. And it starts in this first paragraph. It's out there somewhere between the corporate capital of Wilmington and the neon brightness of Delaware's recreational shore. Out there somewhere, after the byways scatter and the pavement goes to dirt, is a place deep within poverty and at the edge of hope. Well, I was intrigued. I grew up in Southern Delaware. And for those of you who don't know, there are two Delawares. There's Upper Delaware and Lower Delaware. And I grew up in Lower Delaware. And everybody in Delaware knows that people in Upper Delaware often think of people in Lower Delaware as slower and lower, as if we are different. Our language is different. Our style is different. And so I was interested, where is this place they are talking about? I grew up between Milton and Georgetown, which is basically the woods. So I wanted to know, where are they talking about? And then I got a little pissed. I got a little angry, because when I looked closer in this first paragraph, I realized that they misspelled Delaware. And I said to myself, how is this Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper able or possible that they could misspell the state that I grew up in? I got a little upset. I did not let it bother me. So I decided to go on, and I came across the first image of Mr. Johnson. After a day picking potatoes, Mr. Johnson takes a rest in the migrant workers camp where he lives. And as soon as I saw the word migrant workers camp, I triggered on an image in my mind's eye of a migrant workers camp about 3.5 miles from where we grew up, in a town called Slaughter Neck, which my family used to pass by on our way up to northern Delaware. I can still see in my mind's eye an image of these rusted roofed houses in this gated community that we had to pass by. I can still see it. And I triggered on another image of Jose Santiago. In first and second grade, Jose and I were best friends, and we became best friends because we got called racial slurs by a lot of the classmates, which meant sometimes we had to go outside and fight at recess or lunch. And the beautiful thing I can tell you about Jose is that he was the largest and biggest person in first and second grade. At the time, I did not know how old Jose was. I did not care how old Jose was, because whenever Jose was around, we kicked butt. We never lost a fight. But sometimes Jose would be gone for months at a time, and I did not understand that. And my parents taught me about what it was like for Jose and his family to be part of a migrant community that had to go down south and pick crops. I can remember that. And then I came across an image of Lakeisha Burton and Cassandra. And when I looked down at the caption, I saw that they grew up in Milton, Delaware. And then it hit me. These folks writing this article are talking about my community, my neighborhood. And I became angry, because they describe my people as people who live without hope. And nothing could be further from the truth. I was upset. I was disappointed. The folks that we grew up with didn't have a lot of money. This is true. But they had more hope. They helped to keep us alive. And so I came back to the University of Pennsylvania with a very different resolve. And I said to myself, I belong here at the University of Pennsylvania, but I do not fit in. I don't know if you've ever been someplace where you belong. You have the strategy, you have the credentials, but you still don't fit in. That's how I felt, and that's how I still feel. And when I think about the young people and the educators in the schools that we work with, that you all work with and are trying to protect, they are often in that very same condition. And the way I define belonging, I did it through the question of, do I depend on myself, on my difference, on my culture, on my people, my style, my attitude, my competence? The answer was yes. The answer was yes. I can do clinical psychology. And even if I have to do it and write it by myself, I can do that. Whereas I define fitting in through the question, do I want to depend on others' definitions of my acceptance of my culture, my difference, my competence? The answer is no. Especially if shape-shifting, trying to be less threatening, is my sort of way of coping, because one, it didn't work for me. And two, it's kind of grandiose of me to think that I have the capacity or power to change the hate or fear or racial fear of my physical presence. It's grandiose of me. I don't have that power. And so I thought about this and I processed. Now I know many of you know about code switching as a concept and a theme that comes out of the field of linguistics, where folks change their voice or language in order to fit in. And it's obviously broadened beyond that. But I like shape-shifting better because it comes out of the field of Star Trek Next Generation. I don't know how many of you watched the very first year or season of Star Trek Next Generation, but there was this alien race of shapeshifters who could change not just their language, but they could change their body, their walk, their entire being to become somebody else. And when I think about what it's like for our children to navigate a space in school that they belong but still don't fit in, they change more than their words. They change their personality. When we are trying to fit in and be different than who we are, we change our talk, our walk, our personality, our style, our very presence, our dreams, and maybe even our hope. And in that sense, in our work, from the very beginning, this proverb has helped me navigate. My first year, I realized the lion story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. And what we mean in our work when we do this, both research and therapy, is that everybody has a racial story, and everybody's racial story is powerful and important. My racial story is not better than yours, and yours is not better than mine. But the caveat is that if you don't know your racial story, somebody will write one for you. Do you understand me? And then that's not good, right? And the way to engage the power and the importance of your unique story, however you want to tell it, requires some excavation, going into the depths and the shame and the backstory, as well as the triumph. So it's the tragedy and the triumph. Engaging that and facing it is very important for us. It is very important for us as a country to be able to face the things that we are afraid to face in order to get healing from that process. And in another respect, I also came across in our work over years of doing racial socialization research, this notion of racial literacy, which I'll explain more a little later. But basically, in a nutshell, racial literacy is the ability to read, recast, and resolve racially stressful encounters. How do I notice what's happening to me when somebody's mistreating me because of my identity? Whatever that identity is, the stress from it, how do I navigate that? And we're going to talk about that a little later. One particular aspect of recasting is what I tried to do in my story earlier, and that is this ability to calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale. Director Chang gave a wonderful example of how to breathe and exhale in the beginning of this, and it's absolutely relevant throughout this conversation, as well as our engagements with a world that is full of hate. Calculate simply stands for what feelings am I having right now and how intense are they? Locate is where on my body do I locate those feelings specifically? And communicate has two spots, two aspects. One is around self-talk and the other is around images or memory. What do I say to myself before, during, and after a microaggression moment, right? And also, what images come to mind? Let me give you an example. A colleague of mine called me the N-word. I thought I knew. We call him Jerry for 5 years. I was angry at a 9 and I was sad at a 7. Calculate. Locate is where on my body do I feel it? Well, I was angry at a 9 on the back of my neck, like my neck was on fire. In fact, it was the left side of my neck, not the right side. Calculate, locate. And that sadness was in my gut, like a bunch of butterflies fighting with each other, so much so. It was intense, like betrayal. It feels like betrayal in my gut. Locate. Communicate, I said to myself, self-talk was, I thought we were friends. We used to go to the Sixers games together. And images or memory that come to mind is flashback to first and second grade when Jose and I were fighting, or when I was at Eastern College and Roots came on for a tired week. I've never seen so many Black people on ABC from 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, 7 days a week, and everybody on campus was mad. I still remember that. Your images are a way that you talk to yourself when you're under duress. Your self-talk is a way that you communicate to yourself, and most of the time we don't notice it. So that's the work that we're trying to do. And in our work, we have people tell stories. We train educators, police officers, children, adults, professionals, CEOs around the country in our work at the Lion Story. And we've asked them to bring images about who they define as their people. And however you define family, whatever your story is, can you also bring images of that? This is my family growing up, Family Stevenson in Southern Delaware. You can see in this picture, my parents are the only two people smiling. I grew up in a multicultural home. Both my parents were Black, but my father was from Southern Delaware, and my mother was from North Philly. And there are no two places in the world that are different from each other as North Philly and Southern Delaware. They fought all the time. And the reality of their fighting was intense because they were trying to defend themselves on some very important points. But when you see them here in this photograph, they're the only two people smiling because they love being in front of a camera. My mother was a musician and my father was the choir director, and they worked marvelously in front of the camera and in front of the church. And in many respects. Now, I don't know why Delaware focused on large heads. This must have been a genre of photography when I was growing up. But I'm the oldest of three. My brother Brian is next, and my sister Christy is the youngest. And in a sense, the three of us had to navigate the cultural differences of both of these Black people in our family. They both had different strategies of how to protect us from hate. My father's strategy was spiritual. He had us in church 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, or what seemed like to us. And both of my parents agreed that I, as the oldest, had to protect my brother and sister from all enemies, foreign and domestic. They did agree on that, but they had different strategies. His was spiritual. He believed if anybody, Howard, bothers your brother and sister, you're not supposed to get physical. You're supposed to pray for them, knowing that God would get them back in the end. We didn't know when the end was going to be, but we prayed a lot in that context because my father believed that physicality is not the warfare. It's a spiritual warfare, and you are not to sully yourself with physicality. One day, in that great getting up morning, and that better by and by, there will be justice. He believed in that. He fought for that in our household. The people who helped to raise us, many of them, in an AME church in Georgetown, Delaware, also didn't finish the 6th grade because when they were in 6th grade and children, there was no high school in Southern Delaware for Black and brown people. They had to go to Wilmington. My father was able to do that because of a play aunt who allowed him to stay from his years to go up there to finish high school. So the people who helped to raise us didn't always finish high school, but they cared for us. They kept us alive. They were amazing folks. In Sunday school, I love these people because they always gave us candy. As a teenager, I hated these people because they were always in my business. They would tell on me within a 35-mile radius before I got home. And as a grown-up, I fell in love with them again because I see how much their engagement, their nosiness, their love for us kept us alive. So you can imagine how upset I was to see someone describing them as a people without hope. That's my father's side, like Martin Luther King, perhaps. On the other side, my mother was very different. She's more like Malcolm X. Growing up in North Philly on her way to schools in North Philly meant she had to go across racially segregated neighborhoods, fighting and running from attacks from peers and people who did not like her. The beautiful thing about my mother, though, is she gave as much as she got. She threw and she chased and she ran. She was an equal opportunity runner and chaser when it came to standing up for who you were as a person of color. She had a different strategy for me. She said, Howard, not only can you get physical, you can pick up inanimate objects to help you to protect your brother and sister. Now, can you imagine what it's like being in a household of this incredibly powerful, two powerful people with these very opposing viewpoints? It was stressful. Perhaps the most stressful is when my mother had to deal with Southern Delaware because she did not fit in. The Black people didn't like her, the brown people didn't like her. And in particular, it showed up in these public thorough spaces like the Acme supermarket in Georgetown, Delaware. My mother would give us a talk, the socialization talk. What racial socialization is this capacity to prepare your children for hostility. And she had a couple of talks, one that was kind and gentle and loving. She showed us the reality of racism in the world. She showed us the beauty of Black and brown engagement in creating society and civilization and art and music and literature. She was an amazing musician and an artist. She made sure we saw Emmett Till's mangled body that her mother Mamie wanted to make sure the whole world saw so they understand the cruelty of this world and that we were not a part of that cruelty. We were still beautiful and wonderfully made. She was loving when she gave us this. We were the only the family in the neighborhood that had World Book encyclopedias. People would come over. My family got into debt for those encyclopedias. Kids would come over. Can I borrow S? And I would mess with them. It's ST, man. It's ST. That was important. That was a different talk. That was a loving talk. But when we got to the supermarket in Georgetown, Delaware, in the back of the car, in the parking lot, my mother had a different talk. She had a very different tone. And she would say to the three of us in the back of the car, when we get in this store, I don't want you to ask for nothing or touch nothing. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? We said nothing because we knew she wasn't finished. Sometimes she would stare at us intently. Sometimes she would get out of the car, look up into the sky, and as if to pray to God, and get back in the car and start the conversation as if she had never left. I don't care how many other children in that store. They're not my children. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? And we said, yes, Mom, in 3-part harmony, because she taught us to sing. Now, why does this woman give us this talk? Is the question we have, because the irony is that she gave us this talk every time we went to these public thorough places over and over and over again. And the fact of the matter is my brother and sister, we never acted up. We were too afraid to act up because we were in church 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We were too scared. I was always afraid my first romantic encounter, my whole church would show up in the middle of it. I'd be making my move, and as soon as I was doing it, the whole church would show up. The choir would show up in one corner and start singing "Oh Happy Day" or something. And then the praying lady, Mrs. Warrington, would come out of another corner and start praying the house down. I could not take it. My teenage mind would not allow me that level of embarrassment. So I never acted up. My brother and sister never acted up. So why did my parent decide to give us this talk over and over and over and over and over again, knowing that we would not act up? Well, it's a funny thing about this reality. She was trying to teach us the very first racial socialization skill. And that skill is, it's one thing for you to know that you're handsome and beautiful and smart and talented, but it's another thing for you not to see that other people do not see that in you. Does that make sense? That there's a way in which we live in a world that does not see your beauty, does not see your power, does not see and is threatened by it. And as a function, that's what you have to pay attention to. So she wasn't mad at us. She was mad at them who did not see us. And that was an important skill. Another dynamic in the process is the burden that families of difference have to navigate when they send their children out into the world. Some people can send their children from school to after school that goes to the sports program practice and goes to the park and the corner store and come back home and never ever be thought of as less than a child. That is a beautiful world, but that doesn't happen to all our children. That doesn't happen for all our families. That doesn't happen for all our parents. And so I created a measure called Worrying About Racial Profiling, because we know a lot about parenting stress in general, but we have not really measured what it's like to worry that your child is going to be mistreated simply because they are different. And it doesn't matter how old they are. That is an added burden on the backs, on the hearts, on the health of our people. So we learned a lot from that. So we go into the supermarket. Some days nothing happened, beautiful day. But on the worst days, it's going to be tension. You walk into the supermarket, a place you could argue you belong, but you still don't fit in. Because as children, we would see the looks at my mother. My mother had a certain way when she walked. She didn't hesitate. She wouldn't wait. She was not deferential. This bothered the white people in this space. And we could see the looks, the stress, the rolling of the eyes, the sucking of the teeth, and this bothered us. It scared us. So we tried to distract our mother, and some days it worked, but some days it didn't. And on the worst days when there was going to be a clash, it happened at the conveyor belt. And usually in that moment, the person behind the counter, upset by my mother's attitude and strength, decided to do something to put her in her place. And the worst thing they could do is at the sale, after we bought the food, is to then throw our food into the bag. And when that happened, it was on. My mother would begin to tell the person who they were, who their family was, how fast to get there, where to go, and how fast to get there. That's how intense my mother was. She was awesome, incisive, surgical, clinical. Take about 35 seconds, the person be on the floor, writhing in utter decay and devastation. Can you imagine that? We try to warn the person behind the counter, you probably don't want to mess my mother today. It's not the day. It didn't matter. It was over. She was awesome. And at the same time, we were stressed. We were scared. Now, I tell this story all the time, wherever I go, it doesn't matter, to children as young as 2nd and 3rd graders. And part of the reason is I'm trying to convey the importance of story in how we navigate rejection or hate or stress or pain or trauma of any kind. The reality is, though, when I tell the story, it helps calm me down. Because if I can bring myself, if I can bring my culture, if I can bring my competence, my belonging, my people, I feel better to do what I have to do. Now, the moral of the story is both my parents were Christian. The difference is my father prayed before a racial encounter and my mother prayed after you were on the ground if you had disrespected her. And these are the kinds of skills that we try to teach around racial literacy. And I'll get to some more of the science in a second, but in our work, sometimes you got to learn how to pray, process, think through, prepare, plan. But other times you need skills on speaking up, protesting, saying something, doing something, and in the moment, in relationship, in proximity, because as much as we might want to change structural issues of racism and oppression, it's absolutely important. Our young people can't wait for structural change. They need something right now. So in that sense, this is my family, my brother and sister. Sister's an amazing musician. And we ask people to explain their people when they come to us for training. My brother is a famous lawyer. He wrote a book called Just Mercy and started the Equal Justice Initiative down in Montgomery, Alabama. This is us hanging out at EJI. And as a famous lawyer, my brother is so famous. He started this National Museum of Peace and Justice to make the argument that enslavement did not die. It's only morphed into mass incarceration. It's trying to make that argument through. If you ever get a chance, you're welcome to come on down to Montgomery. It's beautiful. It's a place in which you see incredible trauma, but there's healing that can come from that trauma. My brother is so famous, though. Some people don't think he's my brother. It's amazing. People really fight me on this, and it bothers me. So I show pictures of us together just to make sure. But then I got some folks. This was him for his Emmy Award-winning True Justice special on HBO. This is us in front of the Supreme Court. If you ever got a chance to read the book, Just Mercy, it's been translated all over the world. This is us when he was arguing on behalf of Johnny D. McMillan at the Supreme Court, that this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And if you don't know, Johnny D. McMillan was a man falsely accused of killing a 16-year-old white teenage girl at a dry cleaning store in Monroeville, Alabama, where it is known to be the home place for To Kill a Mockingbird. The irony is unbelievable, which he was on death row for 6.5 years for a crime he did not commit and had to suffer the torture of what it means to be in that space. And my brother helped to get him out, as countless others that have happened. But again, people still think I Photoshop myself into these pictures. So I show pictures of us as children when we were so small and before Photoshop, and frankly, before computers, I'm dating myself, were even reality. And these are my two children. My youngest is 33. My oldest is 33 and the youngest is 19. We're not going to talk about how that happened, but they are the why. They are the reason why I do this work. And when I go to third graders, they wake up immediately. I give the same talk when I show this picture because they can smell a photo of Michael B. Jordan in their sleep and they stay awake for the rest of the conversation. What am I saying? Everybody has a powerful and important racial story. My story is not better than yours. Yours is not better than mine. But not everybody's going to like your story. And this is important to know that this poem, that some people, when they hear your story, contract, others upon hearing expand, and this is how you know. We know that hate in schools has risen. My colleagues have talked about it all morning. It's amazing the impact that it has. But these are often proximal engagements. The video that we saw, these are face-to-face encounters, and we have to have interventions in the space of these encounters. We got LGBT students who are struggling with feeling safe at school, right? 35% are bullied, 35% attempt suicide. Many have considered suicide in a sense. We have to understand that the CDC identified racism as a health crisis last year in 2023, right? And we've seen an increase of hate over the last 10 years. But it's not just a mental challenge, it's also a physical challenge, right? When we heard Ms. Ricks earlier talking about the body, very important. That's why we include body in our healing process. Hate harms physical health. And if you look at the research on these ideas, it has impact not only on our bodies, but our hearts, our brain, the way that we think, how access to public illnesses, very important, this notion of weathering. So hate is harmful to your physical health and it's harmful to your mental health. And we have to include the research that's growing around hate on social media. 5 times per day is one particular study found for Black youth in a way that is unbelievable and that it's related to negative health outcomes. The reality is that when we are faced by these encounters, what makes them so difficult that are face to face is it overwhelms not only our emotions, not only our thoughts, but our physical reactions. And in a sense, that all affects our voice. So we are interested in what happens before, during, and after these encounters. No matter where they come. And the things we have to recognize that these moments are not only stressful, but threatening. Threatening is a whole nother ball game. If you look at this mounting research over the last 2 decades, we know that what this notion of that Claude Steele talks about, a racing mind, that when we are stressed by these moments, and other folks have talked about it, is that our brains can go on lockdown. We can, on a scale of 1 to 10, if we're threatened, we're at 8, 9, and 10. And that means that we lose peripheral vision and hearing. We're more focused on what's in front of us and we can't see left and right. So our decision making is compromised. The impact of this research has demonstrated that if we are at 8, 9s, and 10, if police officers are at 8, 9s, and 10s, if teachers are at 8, 9s, and 10s, they're lousy decision makers and they're more likely to distort who is and what is in front of them. Right? And in many respects, we see this in this amazing research from Sophia Showalter out of UVA, doing neuroscience work on Black men, found that in showing pictures of Black men as well as spiders and snakes, she described this experience. The reactions of the participants was that they spiked as if they were faced with threatening spiders and snakes when they saw these images, and called this the stereotype of threatening young Black males so ingrained in the collective American unconscious that Black men now capture attention, much like evolved threats such as spiders and snakes. How do you fight that? We know this is true for girlhoods. If you look at the Georgetown study that targeted identification for girls, and this has been talked about earlier as well. This is more what's behind why people are threatened. Is that when I see and perceive children and girls as older, then I am allowed to withhold, dehumanize by withholding protection, nurturance, and support, which means they don't get the same access. They're more likely to be suspended and arrested from school. And so what's the psychological rationale for justifying distancing myself? We look at this work by Philip Goff about 10-year-old boys black boys compared to white boys, perceived as less childlike. When the participants were asked, how old do you think the boys were? They projected the black boys to be 4.5 years older. Now, if you are a parent of a 10-year-old, imagine if you send your child out to school and they are going to a place where some people see him as a teenager, see them as a teenager. That is an added allostatic load. But it's not just true for 10-year-olds, it's true for 5-year-olds, right? And we can talk about this ongoing. When I go around the country since 2005, I've asked this question: which grade do you think students of all racial groups are likely to be expelled the most? And I would ask you all, but we don't have the time. Most people, when I ask them, I have polled this over many years, and most people say 7th and 8th grade. And I don't think it has anything to do with the question. I think they just hated 7th and 8th grade. I think they hated their face in 7th and 8th grade. They hated people looking at them at 7th and 8th grade. It had nothing to do with the question. The answer, as many of you already know, it's pre-K. When we think about who gets expelled and when, it's an issue of racial disproportionality. And Walter Gilliam has been the best in this country on this. And the reality is that this is a racial problem. It's not, and it's an adult problem, in his words, not a child problem. Egregious overreactions, which I call racial threat. The process of how this happens, we think of as it starts with the stress of being outed or mistreated. And that stress over time leads to some ruminations. I start to think about, what is it about me? And this we learn from children who were traumatized by both physical and sexual abuse. No matter how much we try to help them understand it's not their fault, they will still self-ruminate and negative self-talk. And part of the healing has to come with challenging, with support in those very moments of rumination. But if that continues, then I start to be vigilant. I start looking around, who else is going to come at me? And then I get isolated. I start to feel as if nobody understands. So we can do something about this hate. And this is what we think of. And if racial hate and stress harm our bodies, hearts, and minds, how do we feel? How do we heal from this? And this is what we've learned from 30 plus years of research on racial social. We know that parents, families, caregivers, educators, even police officers who teach children about the politics of race and difference and identity, those children do better from preschool through adolescence, and even for parents. That's the studies we could talk about this. For children who get the talk versus those who don't, they're more prepared. We've learned a lot more, right? In this study that we did in independent schools, predominantly white independent schools, Dr. Jackson Collins, we asked kids, how often are you being microaggressed and mistreated by teachers and teachers? And the more that students of color reported in these predominantly white spaces, the more stress they experienced from those microaggressions, the more they saw the school as a threatening space. But there's some differences here. If you compare the blue line to the red line, the blue line are those who have more confidence to speak up against injustice versus those in the red line. And you can see that those in the blue line, they feel that their school is less threatening. There's a buffering benefit if you have some capacity to stand up for yourself in these spaces. It's also true about belonging, that those who have more racial coping confidence or self-efficacy are more likely to see that they belong compared to those students of color who are stressed by these rejections. They feel less belonging if they don't have voice in those spaces. Another study in public high schools around the country, about 2,500 students, we found that the more that they were stressed, they also felt like they had less racial voice in the school. But those who had more confidence, more buffered, less likely to be bothered by the stress. If I feel like I have voice, which racial socialization brings, then I have much more agency in the space. This is true not only for Latinx students, which got a bigger benefit from finding their voice in the midst of hate. White students also benefit comparatively if they have gotten skills on how to speak up to injustice. This is true for white youth as well. We cannot negate what white youth mean in the context. White youth are more likely to underestimate racial biases, hold biases. White youth are less likely to develop the stress regulation skills to manage interracial conflicts. And and less likely to confront discrimination. But parents and children of every group, racial identity group, can actually make a difference by engaging. And to the point that studies have identified that even white children who have been getting racial socialization can confront other children's racial biases in play groups at 8 years of age. So what's the beauty of this? The beauty is that racial socialization is absolutely helpful. And what we've learned from that work is phenomenal because it helps regulate racial stress, helps build confidence to speak up. Why it's not enough, though, is a lot of parents don't always give the talk very clearly. Some children tell us, students will tell us, my parents love me. They give me the talk about being proud to be Black or brown, but I don't know how that helps me when somebody's coming at me face to face. I don't know what to say. I'm proud. Does that help? No, it's not enough. And that's why we created racial literacy. Racial literacy is this ability to read, recast, and resolve. Let's say how reading is this capacity to see this racial moment in the room. How well do I see it, the blindness? How well do I decode? How well do I notice the harm? Because if you don't notice the harm, you can't heal from the harm. Hope that makes sense. So reading is, can I see the racial elephant? Recasting is, if I'm at an 8, 9, and 10, how do I bring it down to a 5, 6, or 7? What's my capacity to do that? And reframing the impossible to be manageable. 8, 9, and 10, impossible, like facing a poisonous snake or a tsunami. 5, 6, or 7. So recasting is this breathing in confidence and exhaling self-doubt. And this is where CLCBE comes in really, really handy, right? And we practice this over. And resolving is making a healthy decision to engage, not avoid racial moments, to be able to speak up and not underestimate and underreact, where I pretend the racial or identity microaggression didn't bother me when it really did bother me. Or overreact and cuss out everybody, including the cat and the dog, and it had nothing to do with it. In our work, we teach and we train through several questions and practicing of these skills over and over again. And what we've learned in some of these, and when I go around the country, we'll ask people, if you pair up and discuss that first story about your childhood racial experiences, what feelings do you have when you share it with a partner? We get a lot around shame, sadness, embarrassment, anger, guilt. But when we ask the second question, if you had a do-over, what would you do differently in your first story? We get some sadness, we get more pride, we get a change about the possibility of me doing something in these moments and encounters. And this is just over 10 minutes. Imagine if we have an hour, 2 hours, 20 hours. We have also taught children who have been struggling with their rejections, healthy racial comeback lines. And we've trained folks how to do this very well to protect themselves in moments when there isn't a teacher around or somebody who gets this. If my school doesn't get this, what can I do in the moment? It's about healing, not harm, confrontation, not retaliation, dignity, not dehumanization, right? And you have to practice it. And the core thing that you're practicing is, I reject your rejection of me. I do not accept this moment of dehumanization. I can say that. I must convince myself first. And you never have to say it, and you never want to say it until you practice. And if you do it, you got to use your style, your attitude, your tone, your rhythm. Last study we did regarding how do we teach kids how to do this sort of healthy comeback lines, this process, and we've learned a lot from that. I won't bore you with it. My point is that we think we can block the hate process. And part of that is increasing noticing to my body, thoughts, and feelings. This is a self-care process, increasing voice, and those mean we can increase choice in the process. Several projects we've been doing this. One, teachers and students in schools. Can We Talk? Shape Up is where we prepare Black barbers to be health educators to Black men between the ages of 18 to 20. John and Loretta Jamad as colleagues. It's been wonderful. About 670 men participate in this project. Amazing how barbers know how to drop knowledge better than therapists and counselors. And the men leave from our project, 90% of them saying, the barbershop is the one place I can go where most of the time I not only look good, but I feel good. The Play Project, which Brother Lassiter, Executive Director Lassiter, helped me start back in the mid 90s, where we used basketball as a place to help young people work out conflict. We actually looked for conflict to teach them how to use mindfulness in the context of this. And it's been found and supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, embraces the same sort of context and notions where we bring families to talk to their children about these issues. We even hung out on Sesame Street, believe it or not. If you go there, you're going to hear a very different model than CLCB. You're going to hear breathe, feel, share, but it's the same notion when we consulted with them on how young people, very young, can still notice what's happening. What am I saying? Racial literacy is more than about race. It's around how our story is matters. Discrimination is violent, stressful, and traumatizing. Hate harms health through our bodies. And if we mismanage these hate moments in classrooms or anywhere, basketball courts, we tend to engage in unethical decision-making. Racial stress is observable and resolvable if you face it, but you have to do it through story. Your story matters. Everybody's story matters. It takes courage to look for help. Racial literacy is not about blame, but it is about accountability and preparation. And our job is to disrupt that hate, rumination, vigilance, and isolation process. And we are doing that work as we speak. And our goal around disrupting the school to prison pipeline really takes changing racial outcomes in proximal spaces. Question I have, are you prepared? Are you noticing what's happening to you when you're in this battle? America is not about who makes it and who doesn't. It's about whose story gets told and whose doesn't. It's how little we know about other people's stories. It's how hate drains our courage to fight injustice. It's how hate keeps us distant from each other. But it's never too late to find our voice of resistance, to say, that's not my story. I love Martin Luther King, but even in his letter from a Birmingham jail, he got stressed, not as a preacher, not as a prophet, not as a civil rights leader, but as a parent. He says, you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you speak to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television. And see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children. And see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky. He's having a racial stress response right in the middle of this writing. But we all want to prevent ominous clouds of inferiority from forming in our children's little mental sky. So what's your justice story? Where's your outside voice? Are you willing to fight for both of them? And I'll end on a quote from my brother, which says, and we believe in changing racial outcomes in proximal spaces, but we can't change the world if we are not willing to get close to those who are suffering. Our young people need structural change, there's no question, but right now they need something now, not later. Thank you.
I just wanted to sit in that like that silence because, wow. So ED,
Yeah.
please.
No, I was just going to say respectfully, I don't know if the director of HR is on, but I need more than just a bottle of water. My God, just profound on so many levels. And I know, Greg, we have hands that are up, and then I'll bring some final musings from this phenomenal keynote from just an amazing human being. Took us to church, ready to pass the plate. I think Dr. Greg Seaton. I think Dr. Greg Seaton may be on the call. You know, if he is, let's pass the plate, metaphorically speaking. But I'm going to hold space for others, Greg, that I'm certain I might have some questions and or comments.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
from my view, I'm not seeing the hands up, so I'm just gonna invite. It may get a little chaotic, but start with anyone that wants to come off of mute and offer any comments or questions for Dr. Stevenson.
I'll just speak. This is Alexis. I just want to say thank you so much. As a school therapist, this is totally moving for me. I work with kids all the time, from like Berks County to Schuylkill County here in Pennsylvania. But I just, as an inner city kid myself, this was just like totally moving. I don't usually get emotional, but like everything you said makes like so much sense. Like I said, I'm from the inner city. A friend of mine actually from the inner city invited me to this, and I'm so grateful that she did, because this is like absolutely like moving. Like, I appreciate everything you said. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexis. And thank you for being with us the whole time.
Certainly.
Oh, no problem. Thank you so much.
Just a quick question, Doc. That African proverb that I am because we are, I'm just trying to fight back emotions. I heard what Alexis said, but I think you and certainly members of my senior management team know that I'm okay with being vulnerable, hyper vulnerable. So if I start pouring down, I'm crying, it's because I've known you since 1998, and you've helped me, just through identity, trying to, navigate this world at a university like University of Penn. But my question that I think can help us in this space is, all the work that you do nationally, internationally, locally, and even up until this very point, I've known you since 1998, and certainly it's not about me, but what drives you still, um, to do the work that you do, to speak back to perceived power, to love people with the highest form of love, which is agape love, and not dismissing our young ladies, but the challenges around Black and brown males, and specifically Black boys. What drives you after all these years in this space? Um, because we're always talking about that at PHRC, like in senior management and just the agency in general, regional office in Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Philadelphia. We say that we have to show up, and as much as we can, we need to be authentic. Doesn't mean that someone has to tell you that they came down with prostate cancer or breast cancer, but we do share those narratives. We just lost a amazing investigator in our Harrisburg office just about 2 weeks ago, right? And we are faced oftentimes with bearing the scars and the suffering and all the isms and all the forms of systemic and structural racism of others. And then we do internal trainings for ourselves as well, so that we can learn to deal with our isms. But I just think that I would love to know what just drives you even to this very moment, because you still continue to be so disciplined and so driven and just so dedicated to all of humanity.
I appreciate that, man. We definitely go way back. It's hard not to be emotional. I think it is, we know so many people who have not been able to get here, but who deserve to be here. And it's not just boys, it's girls, it's those who seek to identify themselves however they do. They run into not just walls, but battering rams. And all of those people need somebody to fight for them. So in the sense of, if you have a microphone or if you have a platform, and there's this faith thing that we grew up that even the rocks will cry out. So I think I have an opportunity. But there are so many we know that should be here, that should be able to have access to these resources. And this is why, my brother's work around history is so important. I know people are afraid to go down to EJI because they don't want to see the horror, but you see how people are trying to hide and block and lie about that history. It's like gold. It's gold if you think about it, because it's anytime somebody's going out of their way to take away these very important things about who you were and who you are, you see it as essential to how we get into these spaces. So we have to fight for other people who can't fight. I think that's just absolutely real. And we can't think we are better than them because we are here, which is a bigger dynamic. But yeah, I think we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we stand on those who were supposed to be giants.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else have any comments? I mean, I certainly have quite a few reflections, but as ED said, we want to give the space to our audience members. So Isabel asked in the chat, at what age should parents start talking to their children? My guess is very early on, but I would love to hear your response.
Absolutely great question, and thank you. Usually when people ask, when I haven't told them the research on the preschool expulsion, and I said, if you knew that even in preschool, somebody might be looking at your child very differently, because whether you call it implicit bias, which we don't think of as unconscious, it's subconscious, which means you could get to it once you learn. So it's not out of your consciousness. It's accessible if you go looking for your bias. If you knew that a 3 and 4-year-old, your child might be mistreated because of their difference, would you want to talk about it then? And so some of the research is even looking at sleep quality at preschoolers. So you got to really understand the importance. I think the earlier the better, exactly what Director Chang mentioned. And the funny thing is, you're always doing it. So young people pick up the nonverbals maybe more than the verbal. So they watch what you don't say and what you're afraid to say as much as anything. So you're always communicating. The question is, are you in charge of it?
Love that. One thing that came to mind in your talk was it's similar but different was Gregory. So my co-moderator here, when you had mentioned about the research that you had conducted with the barbershop and the therapy that's happening in there and that communal, engagement and that of Black men in those barbershops, it reminded me, Greg, of your Black Fathers Initiative that you started and how it's kind of along that same theory, giving Black fathers an opportunity to come and talk and collaborate and talk about the challenges and talk about how to overcome them in your fatherhood. So that immediately made me think of what we were doing here, what you're doing here at the PHRC. And I love what you ended with, because it's what you, ED, have been talking about, I think, even more frequently in the last 2 weeks, of having to lean in to the uncomfortable conversation. In social justice and civil rights work, we understand that at an agency of 90, we all have our different niches, right, with regards to social justice or that particular population that resonates with us for whatever reason. And that's absolutely okay. But to be in this space and be doing this work, you have to be aware of what our country, what our communities, our democracy, you name it, is facing. And right now, it always has been. But racism, because of the climate, because of the political position that we're in, it's a real thing. It's heightened. It's been uplifted even more than maybe 10 years ago. And we have to lean into it. It's incredibly uncomfortable. But ED's been saying that, I think, on repeat, for the past few weeks, of we need to put the discomfort aside to be able to lean in, see the problems, and do the work that we're charged to do. So that really resonated as an agency with me.
Yeah, and if I could do another shout out for barbershops and beauty shops, is that, the thing we learned, the men who would say that, they would come and spend all day and never get a haircut. They were there for other things. So, I keep getting asked, well, why are Black men like therapy? I said, well, you don't understand what's therapeutic. If you're stuck on therapy and forget what's therapeutic, you don't know and understand. And the things that they need in that shop, we've learned a lot, because folks in beauty shops, they're standing all day, they get back strain, they get arm and neck strain. So we need health insurance in that context. And if we could teach them how to be counselors, if we can get folks who know about business models that can create not only health insurance, but you can get a second job as a counselor, we could do therapeutic in barbershops and beauty shops. And it could be economical, it could be financial, not just therapeutic, if that makes, and cultural. It would definitely be cultural. And I'm not saying all barbershop, but I'm saying we know which ones are doing what needs to be done. So, thank you.
Director Garcia.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point, Dr. Stevenson. I'll tell you that I sent my son Alex for a summer job with one of my favorite barbers back when I had hair. Okay, but because of the truth of the matter is that, if you're a good barber, you are well versed in many subjects because of the varying customers that you must speak to. Anything from sports to politics to social events to what's going on in your local community. education, and it's the reality. And talking about the reality, I enjoyed your presentation so much because of the realism that you put through it, and your interweaving of your own experience and your experience with your family, the dichotomy between the styles of your father and your mother. I found that to be so interesting. And like you, and I said this all the time, you know, discrimination in school against Black and brown, I mean, that's the norm. And it is important to, if you believe you're not being seen and valued, that you make yourself seen and valued. How you do that, I mean, there's the beloved community, right? And then there's by any means necessary. So, we leave it to the individuals to make that choice. But the idea behind it is that, being able to relate as humans to each other and not to give in to our baser instincts. And I think that your commentary, I appreciate very much. I'm taking away a lot from it. And I just wanted to thank you for being here. And I also want to send out kudos to the committee, the moderators, for such a great program today. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Garcia. And I want to make sure that we give space for Dr. G, who's been very patient waiting. So Dr. G, do you want to round out our questions for Dr. Stevenson?
Yes, thank you so much. Just wanted to say hello to Dr. Stevenson. It's great to share in this moment with you and Edie Lassiter. Dr. Stevenson, you've been consistent forever. And seeing the presentation, there are folks that talk a good game as researchers, but I've seen you put skin in the game, and skin in the game for me personally. You put professional skin in the game. And so I just want to say, A, thank you. And then B, as we are on the call, perhaps a community of folks that are on the front lines, could you talk a little bit about sort of practices that we could engage in to make sure that we aren't trying to pour from empty cups, particularly as Director Chang said, given the heightened political environment or the cultural moment that we're in right now?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And I think part of what we've always said about self-care is more important now. We used to also have this, it takes a village to raise a child, but in our work, we're saying, what does it take to raise a healthy village? And part of that means your story matters. So your story is a great place to begin, and their story is a great place to begin. What do you get from your story? The ugly and the beautiful matters. But you have to fight for it. We're in a battle now. We're not in a almost battle. We're not in a maybe battle. We're in a fight, a real deep, serious fist fight. And so we have to look at trauma differently. Some people are afraid to think trauma means you're weak. But no, those triggers mean something ain't right, to alert you to get some support. So CLCBE I threw out as the first thing. Can you notice what's going on? Because you can't heal if you don't notice. And CLCBE as a strategy is meant increasing. Am I aware? Do I trust anybody else to tell me when I am aware or not aware? That's a village that makes sense, right? That's not afraid to challenge us, even on our cultural values, so that we can heal. Healing is essential in this climate. And that's true even for folks who were in Black Lives Matter. You can't be on the front lines all the time fighting for justice and not heal and expect to bring the movement to a place of heightened agency. So yeah, that's a short version. But your story, it starts with your story and telling it and fighting for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stevenson.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to bring to our virtual stage our final expert, PHRC supervisor of our newly developed Civil Rights Outreach Coordinator Division, Cheryl Meck. Supervisor Meck comes to the PHRC with over a decade of experience as a state and local government probation and parole officer. During her most recent tenure, she was instrumental in developing DRIVE, which stands for Diversity, Respect, Inclusivity, Values, Equity, a committee for court-wide staff that encourages these principles when dealing with individuals within the criminal justice system, specifically of Lancaster County, PA. It is a pleasure to turn the mic over to Cheryl to share with us her experience as a former member of law enforcement and current community mediator in our new capacity here with the PHRC, the importance of using the approaches that we have been shared today with us when dealing with youth that are susceptible to the pipeline. Cheryl?
Thank you for the introduction, Director Chang, and good afternoon, everyone. As Director Chang mentioned, prior to my current role here with PHRC, I spent a decade dedicated to adult probation and parole. So I'd like to give my perspective of the adult justice system and how the school to prison pipeline perpetuates this vicious cycle, mainstreaming our youth directly into the adult criminal justice system. So please know that I choose to say client where others may choose to say offender when I am describing the adult that's in the system. So during a client's time on supervision, the probation officer conducts a risk and needs assessment. These assessments follow the risk need responsivity model, and it's important to know that this model is a widely used framework utilized to predict the chances of recidivism, gauge supervision intensity, as well as identify the client's strengths. We look at the criminogenic needs, and those needs consist of antisocial cognition, personality, who are their associates, what's their family dynamic, marital status, substance abuse, employment, education, and what the client does with their free time. Static factors also have weight, and so we take a look at whether or not the client graduated high school. Did he or she obtain a GED? How many times was the client arrested as a juvenile? Was the client ever suspended or expelled? So the answers to these questions, as I mentioned, help to gauge supervision intensity. Therefore, when we are talking about the children that go through the unnecessary harshness of the school to prison pipeline, there is a static record being created that cannot be changed. And this will lead to an assessment score that increases supervision intensity. Thus, from that, there's an over supervision that occurs of the clients, and this directly correlates to an increase in unsuccessful completions of supervision. So what happens? Well, clients are sent back to jail, and then after some time, they're released back out on parole. And again, the cycle continues. This makes it extremely difficult to get out of the system at all. So going back to the criminogenic needs, it's important to know that within the last decade, there's been a shift in the way parole officers supervise their clients. Research shows that clients' needs can be mitigated through evidence-based practices by strengthening their coping mechanisms, keeping families together, offering employment assistance, and working through trauma. So let's take a shift and look at these different trainings that parole officers take. These additional trainings are evidence-based, and they consist of motivational interviewing, crisis intervention, and communication skills. These trainings draw parole officers to focus on uplifting the autonomy of the individual and allowing the client to take control of their probation. And honestly, being a parole officer, or in this case, a school resource officer, simply being someone that's relatable, great with active listening, and humbled within their position of authority, that's the foundation to fostering positive relationships. I've had clients, for example, where jail was the only answer, and yet the jail mail I received, it would be filled with accountability and asking that I do not give up on them. The school to prison pipeline causes our children to be subjected to trauma after trauma, and this leaves a lifelong impact. Whatever ripple effects we can have through the changes of policy, the trainings of staff and SROs, working together to change the narratives of the school to prison pipeline crisis ought to be in all of our hearts, and especially in those whose work can make changes for the better. I'll conclude by circling back to the valuable information and insight we gained from our phenomenal speakers today. This was a testament that it truly takes a village of advocates, social counselors and psychologists, school administrators, policy writers, and an active ear to those with the lived experiences, such as Mr. Parker. Thank you again for this time. I'd like to extend an invitation to our Executive Director Lassiter for final remarks before we go into our closing.
Thank you, Supervisor Mack.
Supervisor Mack, thank you for your presentation, and thank you publicly, because this is the first time that you've been in this virtual space publicly as a servant leader and as a part of the leadership here at PHRC. I want to thank you for joining our efforts here at PHRC. I want to thank you for the talent that you're bringing to this position. And it does not yet appear how you're going to continue to soar. I also want to thank those individuals who make up our new Civil Rights Division, the research, the brilliance, the legal acumen that Hector brings to the space, the work that Montrell brings to the space as an investigator and also as a community person, and the efforts and expertise that Joshua Nix brings to this space. I just want to say that in ending, one of the things that we're contemplating is having this school to prison pipeline conference in person in 2025. Stacy Waters heads up our social justice committee that looks at police and community relations. Director Chang and Supervisor Edwards and countless others are doing trainings in the space of DEIB, in the space of anti-racism. And if we just reflect after we get off of this call on everyone that presented, bios don't do people any justice. I'll say publicly that the Commonwealth should have not lost Venus. Venus was instrumental during the Wolf administration for getting the Commonwealth, those of us in leadership, across the divide during the historical, troublesome, burdensome pandemic against the backdrop of what happened to George Floyd. But once again, something higher than herself has her in the space that she's in, and she's not missing a beat. But that was a loss for the Commonwealth, though she still is impacting the Commonwealth. And so to the organizers of this, those that I know were on the planning committee, and I don't want to get into names because in that Black church tradition, if you name one person, you might forget the other, but you know who you are. Thank you for putting this on. Lots of intersections, right? And you know, you all know that I don't plagiarize. So a lot of the terms I use, they come from Dr. Howard Stevenson. It takes a village to raise a child. That's an African proverb. Dr. Stevenson coined, it takes a healthy village to raise a healthy child. Our villages are not healthy. The African proverb, I am because we are. So you kind of know, you got to peek into kind of like, you know, one of the influences. But, you know, this is just the very beginning. You know, we don't just do conferences for the sake of conferences. We do conferences for so many things, right? To inspire people, to give instructional, teachable moments, to reinforce, to get people to kind of think differently from a macro level, from a meso level, from a micro level. And then also we're inclusive at the PHRC, right? So when we say that the school to prison pipeline is impacting one particular side of the color line, that's not denouncing another side of the color line. And I'll end by simply saying, let's also work on healing. Let's work on healing, whatever healing looks like, and not just for PHRC, but for primarily everyone that's on this call. Whatever our vocation is, whatever our work is, whatever our calling is, whatever our purpose-driven kind of thing that we're doing, let's hold space for healing and you know, work-life balance, and to make sure that the challenges that we see in these schools can be addressed. And I always believe that they can be addressed from a therapeutic standpoint. As a person who's been a social worker, as a person who's been on the board of trustees for the Philadelphia prison system for 8 years under Mayor Michael Nutter, and as a person who has done mentoring over the past 20 years in prisons with young people who parents were incarcerated in the state of federal prison. Just our contribution here at the PHRC to the School to Prison Pipeline Conference, or the Community to School to Prison Pipeline, busting up that pipeline against the backdrop of what oftentimes seems like a white-collar factory, where our young people are on a conveyor belt on all sides of the color line and gender line, how they describe themselves, on a white collar factory conveyor belt, coming out with limited or no skills to compete in the global market economy. But this is our contribution, and so just humbled and honored to have learned from every single person that presented, as well as the questions that are in the chat. So Gregory and Director Chang, as always, thank you for allowing me to hold space not as an executive director, but just as a human being that's passing through this journey called life. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ED Laster. So we are just at our end. On behalf of the Planning Committee, I want to thank you for joining us for this poignant and timely conversation. A very special thank you to our speakers that have taken time out of their day to provide their expertise and provide us with tools that we can use to equip the educators, ourselves, SROs, and any other adult that has interactions with our youth. As adults, we are the examples, we're the models, and we're the influencers on these children's lives. And it is our duty to handle that responsibility and their lives with care. So thank you to my committee members whose names are on the screen. I think they've all come on camera. They've been able to. It was a beautiful experience planning with you all. And I mean, the proof is in the pudding, right? And then finally, I just want for those of us on the call that are not from the PHRC to remind our community stakeholders to please mark your calendars for our upcoming disability conference. It's slated for July 9th. Additional details to come. So please follow our social media accounts for that additional information, as well as to stay up to date on all of the PHRC's events and the things that we're all doing in our respective regional offices to further eradicate discrimination within our Commonwealth. Thank you. And I, on behalf of the committee and our agency, wish everyone a blessed remainder of the week.